it's gonna sound crazy.
Try me.
Well, for starters, this is Sam. Sam Drake. My brother. Hi.
I'm sorry.
This scene from Uncharted 4 perfectly illustrates how far we've come in video game storytelling.
Very wrong.
Take a look at some of the directorial decisions in this scene.
Stuck in there for 15
How Elena
years.
says everything she needs to say to Sully with just a
The guy
look.
who broke him out wants a lot of
And that
money.
look is
Well,
powerful
we can
enough
pay
to
off the
force
debt.
him into
He's
expressing
gonna
his
put his
guilt.
treasure. But that's the good news. We found it. It's on an island just off the coast.
Okay, just stop. Was there ever a Malaysia job?
Watch how Elena fiddles with her wedding ring at a critical moment where she's no longer really listening to Nate's explanation and internally grappling with doubts about their marriage.
Come on, wait. Elena, wait!
I don't get you.
Look, I wanted to tell you.
You know what? Enough.
No, I wanted to, but how could I?
I don't know. Just say it.
I had to protect you.
That is bullshit, Nate. You just didn't have the nerve to face me again.
I knew you would react like this.
How would you react? You lied to me for weeks.
This kind of attention to detail in regard to the human aspect of this scene far exceeds what most people would expect from a video game.
And now you.
But the truth is, scenes and feelings like this in games are becoming less and less rare. Now sure, you can say that other forms of media that utilize animation achieved this years ago. But games are particularly compelling because they go a step beyond. When the cutscenes aren't happening, or sometimes even while the cutscenes are happening, we're not just following these characters on their journey. We're embodying them. And that's a really important distinction to make. It forces us to dive one level deeper into the rabbit hole and go beyond merely being an observer. So when Snake has to kill the boss in Metal Gear Solid 3, it's a big deal. Not just because it's an emotional narrative moment, but because you have to pull the trigger yourself. When Dorman takes control of the Wanderer in Shadow of the Colossus, and the gravity of the consequences his actions have unleashed becomes clear, it's all the more powerful because we get to play as the very demon that consumes him. A twisted, cumbersome reversal of everything we've experienced leading up to that moment. And when Six is finally overcome by the Covenant in Halo Reach, we feel the hopelessness and the weight of his sacrifice, because we're along for the ride with Six until the very last shot. And that brings us to Nathan Drake, having an argument with his wife, people we've known and watched grow together for the better part of a decade now. It's emotionally resonant not just because we like Nate or Elena as characters, but because we're invested, partly as an audience, but more importantly as a participant, and that inherently drives up the empathy.
Who are you?
Come on. I'm me. Come on, it's me. It's different this time.
Oh my God.
I have to save him. I don't even care about the treasure.
The look on your face when you walked into this room. If you're done lying to me, then you should stop lying to yourself. I got a plane to catch. You do what you have to do.
But how did we even get here? How did we get to a place with such wide, sweeping, epic stories, and conversely, stories with such fine, intricate detail that they don't even require a single word, spoken or written, to get their points across? How have we gotten to a point where we can now understand what is happening in a scene between two completely fake characters just by looking at the changes in the configuration of polygons on their faces? How did game stories evolve at all? Who even decided games needed stories? After all, you play them, right? All of this, the big blockbusters, the indie projects using games as an experimental story delivery method, everything that truly wants to not just be played but told and experienced, can be traced back in one way or another to a single line of text. Runmaru Pictures. Hold on, let's back up a little bit more. When the games industry first began, games were exactly what their names implied, games. They were almost all competitive, involved scores, and were designed for arcades, which meant the only real room for any kind of narrative is what you could fit inside the marquees of the cabinet. But it didn't matter. You weren't playing Donkey Kong to rescue a kidnapped princess from a gorilla. You were playing it to have a good time at the arcade or get your name on the high score ranking at that Pac-Man cabinet in the corner of that lounge, so you could embed yourself into local folklore. Games like Pong and Karate Champ didn't need stories. You were just playing them to beat your friends. And more importantly, they were short and infinitely replayable because the ultimate goal was for players to pump in as many quarters as possible. When games moved to home computers in the 80s, things began to change. Storage capacities and operating systems made it possible for games to get more complex. The fact that these games were now being played at home also meant the venue wasn't as biased towards competition, local publicity, or quarter-based revenue. You could actually get into games for their own merits. This led to a revolution of graphical adventure games like Sierra's King's Quest, Maniac Mansion from LucasArts, and ICOM's Deja Vu, and role-playing games like Wizardry, Ultima, and High Glide that had stories and quests, and even in their meager states back then must have felt pretty epic. Games like these were dramatically changing the role video games were playing in people's lives. Around this time, young Japanese game designers like Yuji Horii and Hironobu Sakaguchi, inspired by some of the adventure and role-playing games from this era, were also making a name for themselves in the graphical adventure business, with titles like The Portopia Serial Murder Case and The Death Trap. Now let's talk about these two guys for a second, because they're really, really important. Yuji Horii was fresh out of college when he won a video game programming contest. The contest was hosted by a company called Enix that had only a few years prior began making games for Japanese home computers, and this contest was a way for them to find new talent. The event was kind of like a penny arcade expo of its day. Shortly after signing on to the company, Horii made Portopia, his first masterpiece, a thrilling murder mystery with lots of twists and turns and double crosses. The game was a benchmark of video game storytelling, even though it wasn't very interactive. Horii's work here inspired a lot of other video game designers, in particular a young designer working for Konami named Hideo Kojima, who in 1986 suddenly found himself at the helm of a sinking project called Metal Gear, which he decided to rework into a more thrilling tale about espionage and traitorous allies in the vein of Portopia, a game he idolized, and a few years later would make his own graphical adventure game called Snatcher, partly inspired by Portopia and some of his favorite films. Metal Gear would end up being one of the first games to really bridge the gap between the previously siloed worlds of almost exclusively narrative-driven graphical adventure games and almost exclusively gameplay-driven action games. It wasn't very cinematic in that almost all the story was delivered via text, but in a decade, its successors, Metal Gear Solid, and its sequels, would forge a path for cinematic video games, as you saw earlier in this video. A few years after Portopia, Horii, now with his own development team, combined forces with Dragon Ball creator and illustrator Akira Toriyama and famous anime and film composer Koichi Sugiyama to create Dragon Quest, a role-playing game partly inspired by both Ultima and Wizardry, but casting off the trappings of the long-imposed standardization of Dungeons & Dragons as a basis for its lore and fantasy aesthetic, instead opting to create an original world unlike anything else at the time. And like Horii's previous masterpiece, it inspired many other works, such as Sega's Phantasy Star, Namco's Megami Tensei, and Nintendo's Mother series. Meanwhile, the software programming branch of a powerline construction company was turned into a video game development studio called Square by the son of the company's CEO, who had a personal interest in video games. One of the electrical engineers who worked for the company, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was appointed to be the director of planning and development. Having been a fan of Wizardry and Ultima, Sakaguchi tried to pitch the concept of a role-playing game to Square repeatedly, but kept getting shot down with the explanation that there just wasn't a market for games like that in Japan. Then came Yuji Horii Dragon Quest. By this point, Dragon Quest had already gotten its first sequel, and the series was monumentally popular. Sakaguchi's RPG was not as much of a tough sell anymore. That said, by the time Fighting Fantasy was eventually greenlit, Square had separated from its parent company and experienced a slew of financial failures, to the point that it was on the verge of imploding. With this potentially being their last game, Sakaguchi changed the name from Fighting Fantasy to Final Fantasy. Big shocker, Final Fantasy wasn't the company's last game, and by the mid-90s, Final Fantasy was setting the bar for cinematic storytelling in games, and Square would at one point be the fourth most profitable video game company in the world. Now, the important thing to note here is that all of these artists I've just talked about, Horii, Sakaguchi, Kojima, Toriyama, Sugiyama, none of them had set out to work in the games industry. Horii studied literature in college. Sugiyama worked in the Japanese film industry. Toriyama was already an anime legend by the time Dragon Quest came out. And both Sakaguchi and Kojima aspired to be filmmakers, but were discouraged by their families and economical forces, and chose what they believed would be more profitable and safe careers that one way or another led them to game companies. These early video game storytellers were already cinematically and narratively minded. Games just happened to be the only outlet for many of them to express themselves, and the impact that had on the games industry was an unintended consequence. While all these games that we've talked about up till now poured the foundation of narrative storytelling in video games, we're still not quite to the threshold of what we saw at the beginning of this video. But we're at least back at the title, because this next moment is quite possibly the most pivotal of all. We've now reached 1988, where a game company called Tecmo has already made a reputation for itself as having some of the more impressive cinematic prologues in their games using what Tecmo coined the Tecmo Theater approach. However, one of the designers tasked with scripting and drawing these cutscenes had an idea to spread them throughout their latest game to make it feel almost like a movie. The game was Ninja Gaiden, and the artist was Masato Kato. Kato's decision to basically have an anime movie play out in the cutscenes of Ninja Gaiden seemed pretty incidental at the time. So much so that Kato, using his pseudonym Runmaru, was credited for nothing more than pictures during the closing crawl of the game. But this decision, this credit, this moment in games was absolutely immense in ways no one could have understood back then, both for video games as a whole and for Runmaru, whose career was about to take some very interesting turns. After penning the scripts and drawing the cutscenes for the next two Ninja Gaiden games, Kato left Tecmo and the video games industry altogether to work for then-burgeoning anime studio Gainax. Today, the studio is famous for masterpieces like Evangelion, Gurren Lagann, Fooly Cooly, and many others, but back then the studio was just about to embark on its first full-length television series, Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water, which Kato worked on. The series was very successful and laid the foundation for the soon-to-be legendary director and Gainax co-founder Hideaki Anno to begin working on much bigger projects. But Kato wouldn't follow Gainax on their journey. Instead, he would return to the industry where he started, this time with Square. Remember Square? When last we left them, they were on the verge of bankruptcy and pooled their remaining resources into a role-playing game called Final Fantasy. Now, 7 years and a whole console generation later, Square had released its sixth game in the increasingly popular series and dominated the Japanese role-playing game market. In the intervening years since Kato left the industry, other games had brought video game storytelling to new levels. Games like Eric Shahe's Another World and its spiritual successor Flashback blew people away with their cinematics and moody atmospheres. LucasArts, Sierra, and other companies continued to captivate with increasingly impressive graphical adventure games like the Monkey Island series, Day of the Tentacle, King's Quest, and many others in what would largely be considered the genre's renaissance. While RPGs like Phantasy Star 2, Breath of Fire, and Square's own Final Fantasy IV cut a path for video game narratives intertwined with complex character pathos and plot revelations that defied all expectation. But Final Fantasy VI had completely blown the doors off narrative storytelling in video games, and to this day is celebrated as one of the more formative cornerstones in the development of video games as an art form. Not content to rest on its achievements, Square immediately launched into its next project, one helmed by a monumentous team comprised of, wait for it, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, and Akira Toriyama. The game would be the role-playing, time-traveling, swashbuckling swan song of the Super Nintendo. And it is in this arena, surrounded by all these auteurs who helped drive narrative games forward, that Masato Kato, the man of the hour, returns to the video game industry to pen the script for such a tale, a huge responsibility for someone who basically just walked in the door. But Kato delivered. The game, called Chrono Trigger, would become one of the most beloved role-playing games of all time, and a lot of its success and enduring charm comes from Kato's scenario, which he adapted from a treatment initially written by Horii. Beyond simply being a great game, something about the way the plot was unveiled, how the events unfolded, and how the characters reacted to them made Chrono Trigger stick with you. It was enough to convince Square to put even more faith in Kato's scenario writing when it came time to work on Square's, and possibly gaming's, biggest story yet. One thing to keep in mind before we move on is the context in which these events were occurring. Remember when I said Chrono Trigger was the swan song of the SNES? It was also very much the swan song for an entire era beyond that. It was the last fleeting moment of innocence in a coming-of-age story. In the mid-90s, games were changing rapidly. The whimsical age of discovery was making way for the dark, brooding, growing pains of an adolescence brought about by games like Doom, Mortal Kombat, Tomb Raider, and Resident Evil. Gamers who cut their teeth on Mario and Zelda and the first few Final Fantasies were growing up, and they wanted their games to grow with them. And if Chrono Trigger represented that last summer of whimsical childhood discovery, how would Square transition toward adulthood? Square's answer to that question is something we're still recovering from to this day. Final Fantasy VII wasn't just a great game or a popular game. It was a cultural phenomenon. As a game, it held over many of the aspects that made previous entries in the series successful, while utilizing a then unprecedented budget to demonstrate the power of technologies that were at that point still in their infancy. But its greatest achievements were the leaps and bounds it made in terms of cinematic storytelling, with some of its narrative moments being touchstones for an entire generation of gamers. And some of the greatest of those moments in that regard were written by Masato Kato, who less than 10 years earlier merely thought it would be cool to have movie-style scenes and a story build throughout a ninja action game. And now he was writing scenes about an unreliable narrator locked in the midst of an identity crisis and trapped in his own mind, in a video game. Runmaru himself went on to write the scenarios and scripts for Xenogears, Chrono Cross, and other great role-playing games for Square before becoming a freelance writer. In his wake, Final Fantasy VII left a new games industry, one where games were starting to look more and more like films. It helped sell the PlayStation in a world where Sega and Nintendo dominated the market and espoused the benefits of abandoning cartridges for disc-based media, which could store more video and audio to enhance video game storytelling. Over the next couple of years, many of gaming's most venerable titles would make the leap to Sony's hardware, and bring with them greater emphasis on narrative. And with storytelling taking center stage in video games, many designers and artists coming to the industry scrutinized the storytelling aspects of games in a way that allowed them to find new methods and perspectives to tell those stories. Designers were experimenting with the medium and still do to this day. And because of gaming's increasing power to evoke feeling with imagery, more and more arguments for games being art started to appear. Now, this is still a controversial argument even today. Not long ago, only a few years really, some well-respected curators and connoisseurs of the arts, like Roger Ebert, were questioning the legitimacy of video games as an art form. And how can you blame them? Look at the timeline in this video. I barely scratched the surface of storytelling achievements in video games here, but all of these achievements appear in such a condensed span of time, it's almost mind-boggling. Think about it. Modern gaming as we know it is only about 30 years old. If we were to use Georges Méliès as a reasonable equivalent benchmark for motion pictures, we'd have only just begun using sound in films a few years ago along that same timeline. Games are evolving so fast, we're still trying to figure them out, so it's only natural that some people have apprehension about calling them art. But with the average age of most gamers being 31, we've reached a point where more and more people are being born into a world where video games are already a storytelling medium, and there's nothing to question. They didn't have to watch all the agonizing and awkward footsteps it took to go from games just being a fun waste of time to Elena Fisher fiddling with her wedding ring because her trust in her husband is broken. For them, games will be just another form of expression. And who knows what young people growing up in that world will do with the medium or what stories they will tell.